translation in the area of linguistics and from an anthropological angle remains a frontier to conquer in modern scholarship. This could be due to the fact that it is a multifaceted subject. When it comes to the politics of translating the biblical text, we take into consideration the interrelationship that exists between the methodology for biblical studies and other academic disciplines, such as cultural anthropology, history, sociology, psychology, philology, and so on. Because the worldview of the translators affected their intercultural communication. Many times, the reader of the Hebrew scripture is compelled to use Bible criticism and other reading strategies or techniques to better understand what the original writer wanted to communicate to his contemporary audience. So Bible translation is not about theology only, but it encompasses many other aspects of scholarship as mentioned above, which gives it many facets. Most of the original books that form the Hebrew Bible canon in both Christianity and Judaism were composed originally in Hebrew. The book of Genesis is not exempt from this Hebraic category. It is not everybody of the ancient world who spoke Hebrew, so then translations had to be carried out throughout the centuries. For instance, the Hebrew text was translated into Greek. The letter of Aristus gives a legendary account of this undertaking. The name of the translation, the Septuagint, LXX, comes from the number of the translators. The historical core of the legend may be that the Pentateuch was translated in Alexandria under Ptolemy II Philadelphus, and the other writings of the Old Testament were translated later. The Christians of Egypt took over this Greek translation as Holy Scripture, and later it formed the basis for the translation of the Old Testament books into Coptic. As soon as we are translating, we are interpreting. The same Greek term, hermeneutes, stands for translator or interpreter. In the next sections of this presentation, I will try to advance and demonstrate that with regards to the translators of Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 through 5, from Hebrew to Greek and Coptic, the translations say what they were doing as scribes, their ideologies, and their methodology for their word choices. We have to study both the original text and the translations that follow it to fully comprehend what took place during the translation period. A translation of Genesis 1, verses 1 to 5, to a particular language can be close or far from the original Hebrew text because of theological, historical, geographical, cultural, philological, and linguistic reasons. The scribes who translated the biblical story of the creation of light from Hebrew to a lingua franca of their time had a translation technique. Their worldview had a great influence upon their intercultural communication. The goal of this work is, by carefully examining the first 5 lines of the Hebrew text of Genesis 1, verses 1 to 5, and 2 of the earliest translations, Septuagint and the Coptic Bible, to discuss their similarities and differences. We will discover that the scribes provided a translation that the people of their time, in French we say d'alors, could understand, depending on the consideration of the milieu where they lived and the specific words that they used to express their ideas, straight or in a zigzag manner derived from the Hebrew text. We do not have in the earliest translations into Greek and Coptic versions of Genesis chapter 1 verses 1 to 5 a word-for-word verbatim translation from the Hebrew text. There are places where scribal errors could have taken place, but in other places the translators deliberately chose the words that we have in the text. Also, printed Bibles only go back to the 16th century. Previous to that, the scriptures had to be copied by hand. This was a laborious work and a slow process. So then our original manuscripts could have had scribal errors. It is generally assumed that the parent text of the Septuagint, Genesis, though at times it is difficult to reconstruct, does not differ much from the Masoretic text of Genesis. Could we understand the differences between them on the level of syntax and semantics, especially to say that the Septuagint Forlage was read and interpreted very differently from the Masoretic text? Moreover, the divergences that exist between the Hebrew, Greek, and Coptic manuscripts can be a good argument to support the idea that humans gave their cultural contributions in the translation process of the Bible. The reasons why I have chosen these languages, Hebrew, Greek, and Coptic, are as follows. The translation of the original Hebrew text into Greek and Coptic are among the first translations of the Bible into another language. Hebrew is considered the original language for a passage of Genesis chapter 1 verses 1 to 5. So then it will be the basis for comparison and analysis. Again, the Coptic text was not translated from the Masoretic text, but from the Septuagint. After comparing these two traditions with critical eyes, it should be possible to see how close or far the Coptic text is from the Hebrew text. However, there are differences between the Coptic text and the Greek text, even when these versions are trying to say the same thing. Last, the focus is only the first pericope of the first biblical creation story, because it being the first stanza sets the paradigm for the rest of the whole chapter. For instance, 3 times we read that God created. He created the heaven and the earth, verse 1. He created the marine creatures, verse 21. And he created man, verse 27. Also 3 times God separates or divides. Light from darkness, verse 4, clouds from oceans, verse 7, and day from night, verse 18. 10 times God speaks. 10 times we read, and God said, verses 3, 6, 9, 11, 14, 20, 24, 26, 28, and 29. And what follows fulfills the comment of the deity. Each creation is confirmed by, and it was so, or God made. God created, God did it. Moreover, there was an evening and there was a morning, and the ordering of the days at the end of each stanza constitute the chorus of the hymn. Walter Brueggemann states that this text is a poetic narrative that likely was formed for liturgical usage. It is commonly assigned to the priestly tradition, which means that it is addressed to a community of exiles. Yeah, there are so many different ways that a person can approach Genesis chapter 1. So then it is important to say here that my dissertation will be an example of philological work that can or could be done. This work will address the accuracy of the translation and its fidelity to the thought of the biblical writers, to determine when and how the worldview and theology of the scribes influenced their translations. At issue is the significance of the lexical and grammatical details of the Hebrew, Greek, and Coptic texts of the first day of creation. The goal is to highlight how subtle shifts in translation change meaning. There is always a close connection between language and culture in societies. An understanding of the original language also provides a greater appreciation for the cultural background of the Hebrew Bible. Here, we can raise 4 questions in relationship to this affirmation. Those are my research questions. Why was the Hebrew text of Genesis 1, verses 1 through 5 translated into another language? 2, what did these terms mean at the time during their translations? What do we think a word means? These interrogations will need to be addressed because many variations between the original Hebraic text and the translations can best be explained on technical ground. Preliminary research suggests that this work will prove that the fashions and biblical translation change over the course of time. The differences between the Masoretic text and the Greek, the Coptic translations are for the most part to be ascribed to scribal activity. And the ancient translators were oriented towards both the original text and the reader. First, the aim of this work will be to explain, with the help of an historico-philological method of interpretation, the meaning of the biblical text, and to arrive as nearly as possible at the sense that the words of Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 through 5 were intended to have for the reader at the time when they were written. Every verse has its primary signification, and we understand the text based on the grammar at that time. Second, the basic Hebrew text used here will be the Masoretic text as published in the latest editions of Biblia Hebraica Stadtgartenschau, BHS. The Dead Sea Scrolls that contain material bearing on an earlier stage of the Hebrew text will be consulted, as well as the Samaritan Pentateuch and the ancient scribal traditions relating to textual changes. These documents will also shed light on the origins and development of the biblical text. For the biblical manuscripts from Qumran are the oldest surviving biblical manuscripts in Hebrew. The Samaritan Pentateuch will help us demonstrate that there were variant literary editions of scripture in the late Second Temple period. Third, the book will flow as follows. After introducing the subject, a history of the use of the Aramaic, Syriac, Greek, and Coptic translations will be presented in the first chapter of the book. I reduce my work for the purposes of this conference. Basically, my work will be a critical comparative analysis of 5 manuscripts: the Masoretic text, the Hebrew text, vis-a-vis the Targum, the Peshitta, the Septuagint, and the Coptic Bible. Here we just have 3, Hebrew, Greek, and Coptic. Chapter 2 will be a textual analysis of the Hebrew Masoretic text of Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. This will include an engagement with the critical apparatus of the Hebrew Bible, the Biblia Hebraica Stadtgartenschau. Chapter 3 will compare the Aramaic and Syriac translations with each other because they are related linguistically. One is derived from the other. However, there are places where the Targum reading can be different from the Peshitta, as the latter was not translated from the former, but the Hebrew text. The Syriac Bible was translated from the Hebrew text, but the Coptic Bible was translated from the Greek text, which is the Septuagint. Chapter 4 will be devoted to a critical consideration of the Septuagint version of Genesis 1, 1 to 5. Moreover, the story of the creation of light according to the native Egyptian Bohairic manuscript will be scrutinized in the 5th chapter. Actually, there is no text at all for Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 to 5 in the Syriac manuscript, possibly a 3rd century CE document. The possibility for reconstruction starts in Genesis chapter 1, verse 19, The Sinaitic text is very fragmented. We will discover that the Sinaitic text is older than the Bohairic text. It is true that Genesis chapter 1 verses 1 to 5 is a complete passage in the Bohairic dialect manuscript, but the Sinaitic text was not less than the Bohairic text. Maybe we lost the Sinaitic text through the ages. It should be noted that during my analysis of the Coptic text, comparing a Bohairic verse with the Sinaitic equivalent, where there is material in both texts, will be necessary to understand both. In chapter 6, a comparison of all the traditions will be offered, particularly those that are related or derived from one another. An exploration of the subject will be made in quest of resolutions to the problems cited in the beginning. Also, it is in this section that the similarities between the manuscripts and the reasons why they differ from one another will be displayed. Chapter 7 will lay out some recommendations for a better understanding of the works of the scribes and the translators. The information that was provided throughout this work will be synthesized by tying it all together. Last, some linguistic and philological counsels will be given. There are several issues that are present in both the Masoretic text and the other two witnesses to our story of creation of life. These problems could be textual, exegetical, philological, anthropological, historical, geographical, and cultural. First, the Hebrew Bible starts with the words Bereshit bara Elohim, meaning when God began to create. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1a. Other translations like the KJV, RSV, and NIV render this, "In the beginning God created." Both translations are possible, but we cannot be sure that this difference is more than stylistic. The former translation follows Rashi, who said that the text would have been written by Rishona if its primary purpose had been to teach the order in which creation took place. Later scholars use the translating "in the beginning" as proof that God created out of nothing, ex nihilo. But it is not likely that the biblical author was concerned with this problem. At issue is the fact that none of the earliest translations, the Septuagint and the Coptic Bible, convey the same meaning as the Hebrew text. The Bohairic Coptic manuscript puts that word in the indefinite, in a beginning, following the Septuagint. Could the use of the indefinite article here mean that there were different beginnings, and that the existence of the deity cannot be placed in a specific period of time? We really do not know what that beginning is, and we do not have a specific time for that. Why is this an issue? This can cause problem in future analysis because someone should be able to trace the original passage back and do the reverse from a version. Also, it is interesting to see that we only know what was created, heaven and earth, and the information that we have about creation are about the earth, not about heaven. Even the luminaries placed in the skies that will make the appearance later in the text will receive the divine mandate to shine upon or illuminate the earth. Second, the verse that follows, Genesis 1 verse 2, unfolds to us terms that pagan myths use to depict the primitive chaos from which the gods emerged and against which they struggled for majesty. Efforts are made to throw light upon the matter by drawing upon Babylonian myths, and particularly upon the monstrous deity Tiamat. Can we identify Tehom with Tiamat with warrant? Or is there a connection between the biblical term Tehom and the Babylonian mythological Tiamat? Not the names of deities that are mentioned throughout this narrative and all the traditions. Special considerations will be given to 3 of these terms and how they were translated into another language. A, tohu vavohu, the formless void, a Hebraic construction that makes us think of a primordial order and creation. Then something happened to destroy the earth. Such an assumption is supported by the gap theory definition. B, the deep. The Hebrew term echoes the Mesopotamian creation myth, where it is told that heaven and earth were formed from the carcass of the sea dragon, Tiamat. See, in the same verse, we are told that over the deep was hovering a wind from God. Ruach can mean both wind and spirit. Wind, however, provides a closer parallel to Babylonian text than the traditional translation, Spirit of God. Third, it is interesting to see that in Genesis chapter 1 verse 2a, the Greek translators understood the chaos as unsightly and unfurnished. The Coptic text reads, invisible and flat. Here literally, the text says, without wall. B, the Hebraic phrase, and God saw that it was good, Genesis chapter 1 verse 3a, is rendered into Coptic as, and he, namely God, saw that the light was good unto itself. The subject pronoun is masculine, he. The Coptic translators understood that God is a man. See, the basic Greek word pneuma, meaning both wind and spirit, that is a Greek loan word, and Coptic is also used in both the Septuagint and the Boreal Coptic text. Wind and spirit are their synonyms. So I will try to address these issues in my work through Near Eastern parallels, phonetics, the structure of a language, grammar, morphology and syntax, and jargon. Because if we want to fully understand each one of our texts, we have to consider 1, semiotics, the semantic studies of a text. What are the meanings of the terms involved? 2, morphemes, and 3, syntax. 4th, there are some textual linguistic dimensions that we need to take into consideration. Is my time coming? Should I keep going? Extra. Okay, I will go faster. Okay. 3 examples are as follows. A, Hebrew is an abstract language. Greek is a language that tells us what is going on in the grammatical construction of a sentence. As a matter of fact, a Greek phrase is usually longer than a Hebrew phrase. What happens when a translation is longer than the original, especially when the syntax of the language of the translator requires so? At times, the Greek translators fill in the gaps. Here, an important factor is that it might be that we do not have the grammar that the Hebraic writers used or were using. But before our great Hebrew grammarians, we should assume that the language had a grammar. B, the limitations of Coptic in representing Greek arise in part from its being a language of strict word order. The Egyptian language is position sensitive. For example, Coptic does not possess any grammatical construction comparable with oratio obliqua. Consequently, recourse is made to direct speech. Nor can Coptic truly represent the Greek passive voice, since it possesses only the active voice. For instance, to express he was made, Coptic says in a longer way, they did that to him, or they did it to him. 5th, we should not forget to put the holiness of a language among the issues that we face here. For example, many Muslims thought that the angels were all corrupted and dead, but not the one in Arabic, as they believed that Arabic was the divine language. So then this book cannot be corrupted. Many times the scribes did not want to change the text. Instead of doing so, they gave a footnote to show reverence to the deity and respect for the Holy Scripture. Kitiv Kere. How should we approach a text that is unchangeable? This is very short. We will get there soon. Verse 3, and Boai Coptic says, and God said, let light become or happen, and it happened. What does the creation of light mean for an ancient Egyptian? In his speech, Stephen mentioned that Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, Acts 7 verse 22a. And so for 40 years, then if we consider Moses to be the author of Genesis 1, there is a lot of Egyptian studies to be done here to fully understand this passage. Verse 4, the Boiling text reads, and he saw, namely God, that the light was good, and he divided between the light and the darkness. The Coptic verb that stands for divided, afog, really means he made clear distinction, or he separated. We should note that the light did not replace the darkness. Verse 5, and he, namely God, called the light day, and the darkness he called it night. And an evening became, and a morning became, and the first day. Here the Coptic text uses the ordinal number first, probably for consistency, but the Septuagint reads Emeramia, meaning day one. Verse 5 is unique in that the cardinal is used to modify day, rather than the ordinal, i.e. mia, rather than pote. This is done in imitation of the Masoretic text, which has echad instead of rishon, but ordinals for the next 6 days. I want you to understand this. When we have the stanzas in Genesis chapter 1, first stanza, we have cardinal number in the Hebrew text, day 1, but the 6 other days, second day, third day, ordinal numbers. The Greek text did the same thing, using the cardinal day 1, and the next 6 days, ordinal numbers. But the Coptic scribes, they used ordinal numbers all throughout. It might be to have a consistent text. Reasons for their differences and similarities. This is a very important section, and I don't know if I should skip it really. The differences are because of mistranslations. The translation might have been incorrect. 2, misreadings of the Hebrew. Some Hebrew letters look alike. A dalet can be taken for a resh, he for chet, yod for vav, and so on. 3, guesses because of difficulties in the Hebrew. If the scribe cannot read the handwriting of a previous copyist, he will choose the meaning of the closest word to what he sees. 4, a different Hebrew original, again. This is where it is not the fault of the translator. He did a good job, but it was a different again. 5, socio-historical context, culture, and language. Each culture has its particular way of expressing things. We should be open to the possibility of having the same thing expressed in different ways in different languages. The manner of saying something can vary depending on society. Jerusalem is not Alexandria. 6, exegesis. The translator could have chosen to interpret the text that was before him. For example, the Targum has a lot of that. Similarities, the main ideas, all the manuscripts say that the deity created the heaven and the earth. They also put the fact that God brought order into a chaotic situation by creating the universe. 2, the division of the text. In the Hebrew text, a soft pasuk is used at the end of every verse, and natna is placed under the last word of the first half of the verse. The Greek text uses the comma in the middle of a verse and a period at the end to mark a full stop. All the manuscripts divide Genesis chapter 1 into stanza, day 1, second day, third day, fourth day, etc. 3, each text in its own right If we want to see the beauty of a piece of literature, to a certain extent, we need to analyze the text, that text by itself or through its lenses, because of its own special qualities and not because of a connection with something else. For instance, though a movie is based on a best-selling novel, the movie is great in its own right. I'm concluding by saying that we modern text critics should acknowledge the fact that the ancient scribes knew what they were doing. At times, they came up with a particular translation because it fit their theology, worldview, and jargon. In light of the textual issues that are present in Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 to 5, to resolve these translation problems, I will refer myself to philology, cultural anthropology, linguistics, history, geography, and exegesis. So then Bible translations is a huge field of study. Once more, our attempt here is not to say